Good morning, YouTube friends. It is finally nice in Montana. We've got a beautiful week, 70-degree days, lows in the 50s, perfect for gardening. I thought today would be the perfect day to bring you along and show you my 2022 garden. It's brand new. We just put it in. Some of it's kind of temporary, makeshift. It's pretty small. I want to focus on talking to you today about how to maximize space in your garden, especially if you are in a temporary situation or you have a very small garden space. Let's do it. I have a blog post at homemakingwithoutfear.com that shares these 3 methods that I'm talking with you about today in more detail, gives you examples, helpful links to different things that I've mentioned, products if you're interested, that kind of thing. So make sure you head over to the blog and read that blog post. Leave comments on this video or feel free to email me, Cassie at homemakingwithoutfear.com, if you have any questions. Before I take you to the garden, I really thought about how I have been gardening over the last few years and what I do to get the most out of small spaces. We moved last year, as a lot of you know, and so I was in a rental situation where I was doing some temporary small space gardening, but prior to that I had a little bit more space. I had raised beds in my old house, and then I also had some outside in-ground market style rows. Not a ton of space, but a lot more than I have right now. So what it boils down to for me to get the most out of small spaces is really 3 concepts that I could come up with. The first is utilizing containers. This could be raised beds, this could be pots, this could be buckets, this could be anything that you kind of scrounge up and can put soil in. That could be a container. Old totes, maybe just a circle of rocks that you fill with soil. That's a really inexpensive way to do it, especially if you got a lot of boulders. That could be a free garden bed for you, and I'll show you an example of that today. I've done that in a couple areas on our new home. The second concept that really helps you maximize small spaces, square foot gardening. I have used this off and on over the years, but in this new garden that I put in, I bought some raised beds that I'll show you that came with the square foot grids, and I really enjoyed planting in those this year. Companion planting kind of goes along with this, so you can really put the most amount of plants or seeds in one small area. So square foot gardening, if you don't know, is gridding off your gardening area in a 12-inch by 12-inch grid. So you have square feet to plant in, and there's kind of a rule of thumb for a certain number of plants that you can put in each square foot to really maximize your space. I tend to be an overplanter. I kind of squeeze in a little bit more, but also with the square foot method, I use planting buddies or companion planting. So planting buddies in square feet. This is a great way to utilize a small space. So for example, tomato and basil. You could underplant your tomatoes with some basil, which I'm going to do. I have my tomatoes planted in containers this year, and I'll show you that. Nasturtiums and marigolds are great to add flowers to your garden, which I love to do that, but sometimes you might feel like you shouldn't when you're trying to maximize space, but nasturtiums and marigolds especially can give a little color to your garden and also help prevent pests. So nasturtiums and marigolds with your lettuces, for example, can keep bugs away. So I'm going to do that too this year. The third concept that I really use when small space gardening is vertical planting. This is huge. So if you have a limited space, utilize the vertical to grow your garden. So you can do this with special planters, but my favorite way to do this is with trellising. So I'm going to show you some different ideas and examples of how you can trellis and talk to you about that today. Let's go to the garden. Okay, so the first method I want to talk to you about here is I went ahead and purchased some raised beds, which you don't have to do this. I'll show you an example of how you can make your own. But maybe you have some lumber laying around, maybe you have some boulders that you can form up into a bed, maybe you've got some old pieces of tin, really anything that you can form up and make a container. And if you have a really handy husband, that is also helpful too, because I've used my husband's expertise in running machinery and carpentry a lot this year to get my garden going, so that's been a blessing. But these raised beds I purchased from Costco actually, and they were really, really reasonable. I got two 4-foot by 4-foot beds for 99 bucks. So I'll put a link in the video description if you're interested in these, but they're really, really beautiful, very easy to put together, which is big for me. And also really, really sturdy. I feel like they're gonna hold up. They're made out of vinyl, and they also came with this square foot gardening grid, which I'll talk to you more about in a little bit. But here is an example, if you have a little bit more money to invest, of a container type garden in raised bed style. At my old home, I constructed raised beds out of some lumber, and I'll show you a clip of what that looked like. It was really beautiful. So there's lots of different ways to do raised beds, but this is a great way to get a garden going and also start with really good garden soil so you're not introducing weeds or battling grass in a native soil. We purchased some high quality garden soil this year, and so we're looking forward to having a really productive garden and not a lot of weeds. That's key. To the back part of the raised beds, I've utilized this narrow space next to the greenhouse to use buckets. So container planting using buckets. I have pumpkins planted in these 4 buckets, some different varieties. These are ice cream buckets that I got from a friend, but I've also seen a lot of ice cream shops selling their extra buckets for really, really cheap. $1, $2 a bucket, and they usually have a lot of extra. So there's a good tip. Ice cream shops or delis, different places like that, check with them for buckets. A lot of their food, pickles, mayonnaise, things like that will come in big plastic containers, and a lot of times they'll give those away for next to nothing or even free. So check with grocery stores, delis, ice cream shops, places like that for a really great option for inexpensive containers. Because buckets, like this one right here, that I used to plant my redbud tree, which I still need to plant out, the buckets can be pretty expensive. You can find them at Lowe's or Home Depot, but if you need a lot of containers, paying $5 a bucket really isn't for me. You know how thrifty I am with decor and different things? So yeah, that's just more than I wanted to spend. So free from a friend is really good too. I got like 20 ice cream buckets, so that was a blessing. I've also used in the past totes, like old Rubbermaid totes. Those make great planters as well. Let me show you some other container ideas. All right, as we walk in the greenhouse here, you can see that I'm using all kinds of different containers to plant. Okay, I was blessed this year to be able to invest in this small 6x10 greenhouse. It's pretty short, but it's gonna be perfect for starting seeds next year. I didn't get it up in time to do that this year. And also, because it functions more as a cold frame really, not really a greenhouse, I'll use it more as a season extender. We have a very short growing season here in Montana. Specifically in our zip code, we are zone 6A, but just down the road in the same county, there's growing zones of 4 and 5. Like, it's super variable in Montana. It's crazy. Our zip code, 6A, I'll be using my greenhouse as a cold frame to start things earlier and extend my season into the fall. I plan to plant things like tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and in here in containers to just give them a little extra time to mature and ripen. I'll be doing that using buckets. So I have more ice cream buckets in here. My kids have planted. I let them pick out some things to plant every year. My son has planted cat grass and my daughter's planted calendula, and those are coming up. really nicely. I also purchased some starts, and my kids have started some things in some milk cartons. And I'll be potting up my peppers and my tomatoes this week. I plan to plant my peppers and tomatoes in these ice cream buckets, but I also, for the first time, I'm trying grow bags. I've seen these at nurseries, I've seen them online. I've never used them myself, but I got this one on sale for a really good price, and this one's large and has 3 different slots. I'm gonna go ahead and plant some of my bigger tomatoes, my bushier tomatoes in that container and see how they do. Now my greenhouse is really short, so I'm gonna have to do lots of pruning and make sure everything stays nice and moist to do well in here. So we'll see how this goes. My first time ever actually planting in a greenhouse for the season. More container ideas. I have just these inexpensive pots that I got at the dollar store, so that's a great option. Also, sometimes nurseries will sell you their extra black pots that maybe their trees come in. So raised beds, pots, buckets, grow bags, you can really plant in anything that will hold soil. I've seen some really cute planters made out of old galvanized tubs. I've seen people plant in shoes, patio rail planters that just kind of hang out on the patio rail. Those are really clever use of space. A couple methods that I utilized this year, because we have so many boulders, is just forming some planting beds to hold soil out of our rock. And then also we have a lot of timber on our property that we had to move to build the house. So I also used some logs. Well, my husband put together an asparagus bed for me using some of the logs off of our property. So let's walk over to the asparagus bed and I'll show you some examples of raised bed container type gardens. It is a beautiful day today. I am ready for this weather. Here's an example of how we use some of the native boulders to just kind of line up along a corner of the house, and then I put a thick layer of cardboard down. Of course, there's not a lot of grass here, it's mostly gravel, but I put a thick layer of cardboard down to help smother grass, discourage weeds, and then we filled it with some good garden soil and then a little bit of topsoil that I'll mix in. And then I'll do some flower planting in this area, mostly flowers and herbs and maybe a tree in the front of our house. So there's an example. The soil this year is a little bit more expensive per square yard, but if you have good soil already, then this would be really expensive way to put together a garden bed. Here's another example of using where I've used some native stone to just kind of form up a little wall, and then I filled in with some soil to make a little bed. So that was really inexpensive way to maximize space and make things pretty. We've got a lot to do, but I just have to plant things to just get some beauty going or else I'll lose my mind. Okay, let me show you the asparagus. Here's our asparagus bed that we put in yesterday. My husband had these logs that he removed off the property, so he just lined a couple of them up. It's about 12 feet long, and I was able to put 12 crowns of asparagus in here yesterday. It needs to be watered really well, so we'll be doing that, watering everything at the end of the video actually. But this was really inexpensive. This area that I chose to put it in will eventually be where I do our larger garden with kind of no dig market style rows, not because we're going to be selling anything, but market style, meaning it'll produce a lot more. It was just more than we could do this year. I tend to overplan and overestimate our abilities. So I decided to scale back and just do the small garden this year that I showed you, and we put up kind of a makeshift deer fence. We've got deer and elk we have to keep out, And fencing is super expensive. So fencing this larger area just probably will not happen this year. That'll be a next year's project that I look forward to doing with you. So this bed is, I think it looks really nice. It's maybe not beautiful by some standards, but to me, it's about practicality and using what you have. So we had these laying around in a big pile. Instead of burning them or using them for something else, I said, hey, will you make me an asparagus bed? Because lumber's really expensive. So we did, and we filled it with some good garden soil and sand mixture. So hopefully the asparagus will do well. It'll be a few years before we can harvest. But here's an example of how you can make a really inexpensive and fast, this was very fast raised bed. Of course, you might need a little bit of equipment to do that because those logs are heavy, but we are blessed that we have that for our business. Okay, so there's some examples of different types of containers that you can use. Containers is a really economical, thrifty way to maximize your garden space. We're back in the garden, and I'm going to jump into the second method I was talking to you about maximizing your small garden space. Planting buddies in square feet. Square foot gardening is utilizing a 1 foot by 1 foot or 12 inch by 12 inch grid to plant in and really maximize the plants that you put in each square foot of your garden, and also keeping in mind things that like to be planted together. So maybe in your square foot you could plant more than one thing. So for example, I have some lettuces planted here. I actually planted most of my garden seeds yesterday, but I have microgreens and lettuces planted here, and you can actually plant like 16 groups of microgreens and at least 4 heads of romaine lettuce per square foot. So I'll share with you a link to a little guide, a square foot gardening guide that's really helpful. But I can also plant things like nasturtiums and marigolds in here to keep the bugs and insects out of my garden. You can utilize the square foot gardening method in any kind of container or bed. Those ice cream buckets I showed you are about a 12-inch bucket, so use that as your square foot garden. You could also just grid off an area either with sticks or string. Use that as your square foot guide. In a 12-inch ice cream bucket with a tomato, I'll probably underplant with some basil. Basil and tomatoes are good companions. Basil helps repel insects, and it also, I've read that it helps give your tomatoes a better flavor. So we'll be trying that this year. Here in this square foot area, I have carrots planted. I have 3 square feet of carrots, and most of this will just be for fresh eating. So another example of utilizing your space and maybe kind of planting buddies is carrot and radish. So you can sow your carrot seeds like you normally would, and also in between the carrot seeds plant radish. Radish germinates really fast, so by the time your radish is coming up and you have a bulb that is mature enough to pick and eat, your carrots should be coming up and becoming well established. Carrots take forever to germinate. That's kind of why I have them covered with cardboard. They don't need sunlight to germinate and get going, but it will take them 10 up to 14 days sometimes to even germinate. Radishes germinate overnight, it seems like. So that's a great example of how you can utilize the same square foot for a couple different types of veggies. So I'll harvest the radish, and then that will leave more space for my carrots to grow. Along the same lines of planting the same square foot, you could also succession plant, which means you plant something, you harvest it, and then you make a second planting of something else, or maybe the same thing. So for example, I have microgreens planted. They will come up and be a quick harvest, and then I will probably plant something else in their place. Maybe some more lettuces, maybe some more radishes, whatever the family is feeling like they're ready to eat again. The good thing about Montana is it's usually not too hot that we can't put something else in the ground. Sometimes lettuces and spinaches will just go right to bolt if it's too hot, but we can usually succession plant greens pretty well. A kale is another option. So maybe I would save space in my garden and not do kale quite yet, but I would succession plant kale after my microgreens. There's an idea. Friends, we are back in the greenhouse to talk about my third method for maximizing garden space, and that is growing vertically. So when you don't have a lot of square inches or feet to grow in, think about what you can do using your vertical space to maximize your harvest. So there's a lot of things that like to grow up. Tomatoes, cucumbers do well, trellising and growing up, squashes, peppers of course will grow vertically. I've got tomatillo in here. I've got some ground cherry, which I'm also going to try to trellis up. So think about plants that typically will sprawl on the ground, but you want to train them to go upright so that you can utilize your ground space for other things. So vertical gardening, how can you do this? Trellising is a really great way to do this. I use a couple different types of methods of trellising in my garden, and I'll talk to you about that. But also think about vertical containers. My favorite vertical container is the Greenstalk Garden. If you haven't heard about these, they are so cool. This is just a small family company. They came up with these containers that have a unique watering system where you water from the top and it waters all of the different tiers. It's just a really cool thing, and I will show you mine. I just set mine up for the year. It's not even planted, but I will show it to you. If you're in the market for a vertical planter, if you are going to patio garden or back porch garden this year, you can plant an amazing amount of food in one of these planters. All right, so in my greenhouse, I'm going to be trellising my tomatoes and growing them upright using a string type trellis. So I have a wire or a string going across the top. I don't have a lot of headspace to work with, so I'm going to be pruning these tomatoes well and just keeping them from getting too bushy, hanging down. And what I'm going to do to keep it upright and under control is I'm just going to wrap the string around the main stalk of the tomato. Okay, it doesn't have to be tight at all. And granted, I don't have a lot of wind or weather to deal with in here, but I'm just going to start it out like this. And you can even put a little garden stake to hold the string down if you like. I don't think that's even necessary. And then as the tomato grows, I will just continue to wind along the top of the plant. I'm also going to trim off any of the little suckers that happen. The main branch is coming off the main stalk, and in between this V, sometimes you'll have a extra branch grow, and those are the suckers. And I'm going to trim those off and be pretty aggressive about it because I just don't have the space to let this grow and bush out this year. Now this tomato here is an Oregon Spring. I hadn't heard of that variety, but I picked it up from my local greenhouse, and it's a determinate. And what that means is it has a determined amount of flowers or fruit or of growth that will happen, as opposed to an indeterminate type of tomato, which will continue to grow, continue to flower, continue to produce fruit throughout the growing season. Indeterminate plants can get quite tall, 10, even 15 feet if you let them. And in a small garden or in a small greenhouse, you just don't have the space usually to grow an indeterminate. So most cherry tomato and grape tomato varieties are indeterminate, and they just get huge and bushy. So when you're buying your tomatoes, maybe consider the varieties, or any plant, consider the varieties that you're picking up. I would recommend a determinate tomato for a greenhouse or a small space. Also because when you're pruning a determinate, because there's a determined amount of fruit, if you're pruning aggressively, then you may have lower yields for your tomatoes. So consider that. And an indeterminate will continue to produce. You can prune those pretty aggressively and they'll still produce, they just get really big. Getting hot in here. Whew, 80 degrees with the vents open in the greenhouse. That's awesome. So I just have a little stake. My lemon and my lime tree actually came with this, but this is just an example of how you can keep a plant growing vertically. You can use some tape or you can use twine to just very loosely tie your plant to a stake. So I'll probably do that with my peppers in here. I could use the string trellis as well, but I don't know that they'll need that. We'll just kind of see, but I'll definitely stake my peppers to keep them from toppling over when they get really big. Yeah, everything's growing. What do you got, you flowers?
At the back, you're gonna drop them.
So some other options that you could use for trellising is maybe a DIY trellis. So I have this piece of wire left over from fencing, and what I'll likely do for my peas is just stake this on both sides into the ground and use this as my support for my peas. So I'll stake it in the ground just like this. My peas can grow up and be supported on this wire. So that's really inexpensive. I won't have to pay for anything for that kind of trellis. Another favorite trellising idea that I have used before, which is great for vining green beans or vining flowers, is using a cattle panel. Now I haven't looked at my cattle panels yet, but if you can imagine this is a cattle panel, if you can imagine this was actually a cattle panel, and I folded it over and secured it at the bottom, maybe with stakes or 2x4, and it will just stand upright on its own, and I have peas planted on this side, I have green beans planted on this side, and it will grow up over this cattle panel, and you can actually walk right through it. Now, of course, this is too short because this is just a piece of wire, but that's just an example, and that ends up looking really, really beautiful. That is a favorite trellising method of mine. For tomatoes and peppers, you can also purchase wire cages. I don't tend to like that because I find it difficult to kind of get in there. You can also use just a scrap piece of wire and form it into a circle and make your own tomato cage and just stake it into your container. Along the same lines as cattle panel trellis, you can use just this rolled hog wire that we have used to make our little fence, and just T-posts. Put that up in your garden, similar to what we have here, just rolled wire between two T-posts, and you can grow right against this as your trellis. I have my pumpkins growing, and actually I have another kind of squash growing there. I can't remember what it was, but I may just trellis it up on this if it's sturdy enough, rather than letting them sprawl on the ground. So my final example of growing vertically, other than trellising, is my Greenstalk planter. This is the original planter, so it is deeper. It's got a 10-inch pocket instead of a 7-inch pocket. The leaf planter by Greenstalk actually has a shallower, wider pocket, so you can stack more tiers. This is 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a 5-tier planter with the watering system on top. Leaf planter allows you to stack up to 7, so you can get, I think, anywhere between 3 to 7 tiers going, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's 6 pockets on this original planter on each tier. So that's a lot of oh, there's 7. So that's a lot of planting area. I'm amazed at how much I can actually fit in a Greenstalk. I'll insert some clips of Greenstalk examples. We'll be planting things like kale and sweet basil, some flowers, maybe something that vines, maybe try some peas. I've seen green beans do really well in these plants, but we'll definitely be putting some beautiful flowers because I have it on my patio where it's going to be a little bit more shaded, and we'll just see how it does. If any of you are interested in getting a really awesome vertical planter and want $10 off your first order, check out my link below. All right, well, thank you guys for joining me in my garden today. I'm gonna have to get going because the baby is playing in the mud puddle and I need to get back to gardening. Don't forget, if you have a small or a transitional garden, utilize these 3 concepts to maximize your growing space. Use containers, plant in square feet with buddies, and grow vertically. Don't forget to check out my blog post that talks more about this. Visit my links if you're in the market for any products that I might have mentioned. Have a beautiful, blessed summer and happy gardening.
Full stop. Can't believe I live in your thoughts. I think about you all the time, morning, evening, and midnight. Such a wonderful delight. Everything that I own, yeah, I'd give it all up now just to be with you somehow. Unexpected love was